Sophia adjusted the stiff collar of her uniform as she stood near the entrance of the grand Barrow estate. She had worked at many upscale events, but none as opulent as those hosted by Adrian Mallory. The mansion loomed behind her, a beacon of wealth she could only dream of. Marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and an air of luxury that seemed infinite. For Adrian, these grand soirees were more than just gatherings. They were performances. His guests were the audience, and the opulence was his mask, a glittering facade to hide the bitterness that had consumed him since his wife Hannah passed. Sophia had heard whispers from the other staff. Adrian had not always been this way. His events had once been known for their warmth and joy, but now his eyes carried a coldness that chilled even the most seasoned servants. He had developed a reputation for finding cruel amusement in humiliating those beneath his station, a habit that left a trail of wounded pride and broken spirits. Despite this, Sophia kept returning. She had no choice. The pay was too good to pass up, even if it meant enduring the sharp looks from Adrian's elite guests and his occasional cutting remarks. As a single mother to 6-year-old Liam, every dollar was essential. She would swallow her pride for her son, sacrificing her own dignity to ensure he had food, clothes, and a shot at a life better than hers. Tonight the air inside the mansion was heavy with the scent of roses and money. Guests sipped champagne from crystal flutes, their laughter a low murmur that echoed off the walls. Sophia wove through the crowd, balancing trays of horse doves, with the practiced ease of someone who had perfected the art of being invisible. She was just another uniform, another pair of hands. As she moved through the sea of silk, gowns and tailored suits, her eyes landed on the grand piano in the far corner of the room. Its polished, ebony surface gleamed under the chandelier's light, drawing her attention like a magnet. Sophia's breath caught in her chest. Music had once been her sanctuary, before life unraveled. She had played the piano every day. It had been her escape, the one thing that made her feel connected to a world larger than her modest beginnings, but those days felt like another lifetime. Without thinking, she found herself staring at the instrument, a familiar ache rising in her chest. Her fingers brushed the edge of her tray as a quiet sigh escaped her lips. "Do you like the piano?" The voice jolted her back to reality. Sophia spun around, her heart pounding. Adrian stood behind her, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his sharp eyes locked on hers. She had not heard him approach, and now wished she could disappear into the floor. "I am sorry, sir," Sophia stammered, lowering her gaze. Staff were not supposed to engage the host unless addressed, and even then, the unwritten rule was to tread lightly. Adrian's lips curled into a slow, cruel smile. "Beautiful, is not it?" he said, his voice smooth, but laced with a venom that made her skin crawl. "Hannah used to play it. She had a gift. But of course that is in the past now." His gaze darkened, and Sophia felt a chill run through her. "You should remember your place," he said coldly. "Admiration is for those who can afford it." The room seemed to shrink around her. Sophia's cheeks burned with shame, and her throat tightened. She wanted to apologize again, to say something that might diffuse the tension, but her voice refused to come. She felt the weight of curious eyes on her, staff members whispering amongst themselves, guests glancing her way with detached curiosity. Adrian did not wait for her to respond. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he turned and strode away, leaving Sophia standing in the center of the room, humiliated and small. That first encounter with Adrian Mallory had set the tone for everyone that followed. Sophia quickly learned to avoid his gaze, to move silently through his parties like a shadow. The other servers had warned her about him, and now she understood why. Adrian was not merely a grieving widower. He was a man who had lost his compassion, a man who wielded cruelty like a weapon. Sophie had learned to read people, but it did not take much to see that Adrian Mallory was a man who had buried his humanity beneath a fortress of bitterness. His cruelty was not accidental. It was a deliberate shield, wielded to cut down anyone who dared to get close. Still, no matter how harsh the nights at his estate became, Sophie returned. She had to Every glass of champagne she served, every insult she endured, was a small step toward a brighter future for her son, Liam, at 6 years old. Liam was her entire world, and Sophie was determined to give him what she had never had: a good education, a secure home, and the chance to dream without limits. Her own life had derailed at 17, when the boy she thought she would love forever left her behind, pregnant, alone. Sophie had not even finished high school. She did not have time to mourn the life she would imagine for herself instead. She worked tirelessly, hustling to keep food on the table and a roof over Liam's head. This job, degrading as it sometimes felt, was a necessary rung on the ladder to a better future. Pride was not a luxury she could afford when rent was due and Liam's shoes were too tight again. As the party at Mallory Manor carried on, Sophie moved like a ghost through the crowd, blending seamlessly into the background. The sting of Adrian's earlier words lingered, their cruelty clinging to her like a second skin. He had not just dismissed her, it made her feel small, unworthy. The evening itself was grand, even by Adrian's standards. The mansion's grand hall was awash in opulence, with live music filling the air, and cascades of fresh flowers adorning every corner. It was the kind of spectacle designed to awe the guests, and it succeeded. Yet Sophie could not help but feel that, beneath the glittering surface, there was something darker, especially in Adrian's demeanor. His restlessness was palpable. He had soared before the first guest arrived, the loneliness he refused to confront twisting his mood. He had grown so accustomed to wielding arrogance that it now seemed as natural to him as breathing. The guests were props in a play he staged for himself, placeholders for the joy and love he had lost, their laughter, their admiration. They were all empty to him. And tonight, that emptiness seemed to gnaw at him more than usual. Sophie's steps were measured and deliberate as she navigated the crowd. She had mastered invisibility, the art of fading into the scenery at these events. But no matter how practiced her movements, she could not shake the feeling of not belonging. It was not just the wealth that separated her from these people, it was their ease, the lightness with which they floated through life. For Sophie, existence was a grind, a daily struggle to reach the next payday. She worked to ensure Liam never bore the weight of her struggles, but sometimes that weight felt insurmountable. As she passed the grand piano in the corner, its glossy black surface gleaming under the chandelier, Sophie allowed herself a fleeting glance. Memories stirred of childhood piano lessons, of music that once filled her heart and gave her solace. She had not touched a piano in years, had not dared to dream of it for just a moment. She let herself imagine what it would be like to sit there again, to play, to feel the music flow through her fingers. Still admiring it, are you? The voice sliced through her reverie, sharp and mocking. Sophie's body tensed as dread coiled in her stomach. She turned slowly, forcing her expression into polite neutrality, only to meet Adrian's piercing gaze. His eyes were sharper than usual, his smile a hollow mask that did not reach them. He crumbled a glass of whiskey, and the way he looked at her sent a chill through her spine. "I am sorry, Mr. Mallory," Sophie said softly, her voice steady but cautious. She had learned her lesson after their first encounter: never show weakness. Adrian tilted his head slightly as if appraising her. "You have been working these events for a while, have not you, Sophie?" She swallowed, nodding slightly. "Yes, sir." And yet he continued, his tone deceptively light. "You have never really had the chance to enjoy them. Always working, always serving. How dull that must be." The words made Sophie's skin prickle. This was not a compliment, it was a trap. She kept her expression carefully blank, unsure of where this was heading. "You deserve a little fun, do not you?" Adrian's voice carried a mocking lilt, but there was an edge beneath it, something calculated. Sophie did not respond immediately. She felt the weight of his gaze, the predatory way he loomed over her. Her instincts screamed at her to tread carefully. Adrian Mallory was a man who thrived on control, and she had no intention of giving him the satisfaction of seeing her squirm. "I am here to work, sir," she said finally, her voice even but distant. Adrian chuckled, a sound that was anything but warm. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. Sophie's heart raced, but she refused to break under his scrutiny. This was his game, she realized, and for now she was a pawn. Sophie's stomach churned as Adrian Mallory spoke, his tone almost conversational, but laced with a malice she could not ignore. "I have been thinking," he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "My birthday is next weekend. It is going to be quite the celebration. Why do not you come as my guest? Bring your son too. It will be a nice change of pace for you." The world seemed to stop. Sophie felt the weight of his words pressing down on her, her instincts screaming to refuse. This was no act of kindness. The invitation was not genuine. It was bait, a carefully laid trap. But what choice did she have? Sophie relied on this job, as degrading as it could be. And he knew about Lime. Adrian was using her son to back her into a corner. He saw the hesitation flicker in her eyes and leaned in slightly, his smile widening in a way that made her skin crawl. "Come now, Sophie. You have worked so hard, let me repay you," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. I insist. The charm in his voice was as false as the warmth in his gaze, but Sophie knew she could not refuse. Saying no to Adrian Mallory might cost her everything she worked for, and she could not take that risk, not with Liam depending on her. So she forced herself to say the words, though they tasted bitter on her tongue. "I would be honored. Thank you for the invitation." "Wonderful," Adrian said, straightening up, clearly pleased with himself. "I will make sure the staff sends you all the details, and do bring your son. I would love to meet him." With that he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sophie standing there, her hand trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her, but it was no use. She knew this was not just an invitation. Adrian had something planned, and it was not going to be pleasant. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sophie moved through her tasks, smiling when required, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation over and over. Why had he singled her out? What was he trying to accomplish? Nothing about it felt right. When she finally arrived home that night, Liam was already asleep, his small body curled under the warm blanket on his bed. Sophie stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him breathe softly. Her heart ached. How could she protect him from this? How could she shield him from a world so cruel, when she was barely holding it together herself? She sat at the kitchen table, the silence of their tiny apartment pressing in on her. The weight of Adrian's invitation settled over her, like a heavy cloak. Next weekend, she would step into his world, not as a server but as a guest. Yet deep down, she knew it would not be a celebration for her. The following Saturday, Sophie stood outside the towering gates of Mallory, Manor, gripping Liam's small hand tightly. The iron barrier loomed before them, an imposing symbol of the world they did not belong to. Liam, usually brimming with energy and curiosity, was unusually quiet, his wide eyes taking in the sheer grandeur of the estate. Sophie's nerves were a tangled knot. She had done her best to dress appropriately, wearing a simple dress that had seen better days, and made sure Liam's shirt and trousers were clean and neatly pressed, but no matter how hard she tried, she knew they would stand out among the polished guests. As the valet opened the gates, Sophie forced herself to move forward, praying silently for the evening to end quickly. Inside the mansion, the opulence hit them like a wave. The crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and intricately woven tapestries were overwhelming. Liam tugged at her hand, his innocent voice breaking through her anxiety. "Mom, this place is huge," he whispered, his eyes darting around in awe. "It is," Sophie murmured, squeezing his hand gently. "Just stay close, okay?" They navigated through the elegantly dressed crowd, the hum of polite conversation swirling around them. Sophie felt the weight of every curious glance, though no one openly acknowledged them. The indifference was palpable. She knew these people lived in a world far removed from hers, where life was measured in wealth and status. In this world she and Liam were invisible, out of place. Sophie's heart sank further as she caught sight of Adrian across the room. His commanding presence was impossible to ignore. He was impeccably dressed, a glass of whiskey in his hand, as he surveyed the room like a king holding court. Their eyes met. Adrian's lips curled into a slow smile, and Sophie's stomach twisted in response. There was no warmth in his expression, only calculation. She knew then that tonight would be a performance, and she was about to play a role in a game she did not understand. Before she could break eye contact, Adrian raised his glass in a silent, mocking toast. Sophie managed a thin, forced smile in return, her heart pounding. The message in his gaze was unmistakable. Tonight she was part of his game, a pawn to be moved at his will. The evening dragged on, the air thick with the mingling scents of expensive cologne and fresh-cut flowers. Sophie and Liam remained near the edges of the room, as inconspicuous as possible. She observed the guests laughing easily, sipping from crystal glasses, and exchanging shallow pleasantries. Every so often Liam tugged gently at her hand, his curiosity about the grand mansion evident. But Sophie could also sense his unease, a reflection of her own. They did not belong here, and both of them knew it then. As if on cue, the music stopped. The abrupt silence made Sophie's breath hitch. She turned to see Adrian stepping forward, effortlessly commanding the room's attention. The hum of conversation died instantly as the guests turned toward him. Adrian stood tall, the very image of wealth and authority. His voice was smooth and compelling, drawing everyone in with ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone practiced and charismatic. "Thank you for joining me tonight. It is always a pleasure to host such fine company." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Sophie swallowed hard, dread coiling in her chest. She could feel the weight of Adrian's gaze returning to her this evening. He continued, his eyes gleaming with something sharp and cruel. "We have a very special guest, someone who has shown a remarkable interest in the finer things in life, particularly my late wife's beloved piano." Sophie's stomach dropped, a wave of cold dread washing over her. The entire room seemed to turn toward her. Hundreds of eyes suddenly focused on her alone. Her pulse thundered in her ears as Adrian's gaze locked onto hers, his words dripping with mockery. "I would like to introduce Sophie," Adrian said, his smile widening as the attention on her grew. "One of our most dedicated staff members. She has always had a fondness for the piano, and tonight I thought we might give her the opportunity to share that with all of you." He gestured grandly toward the piano in the corner of the room. "Sophie, why do not you show us what you have got?" The air shifted thick with tension. No one laughed, but the silence felt more cutting than ridicule. The guests watched with a charged curiosity, waiting to see what she would do. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, her mouth dry as sand. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, to vanish into thin air, but Liam stood at her side, his small hand in hers, his wide eyes shining with trust and excitement. He did not understand the cruelty of the moment. To him this was not a humiliation. It was an opportunity, a chance to see his mother do something extraordinary. Sophie had no choice but to be strong. If she faltered, if she let her fear show, Liam would feel it too. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Straightening her spine, she nodded. "I would love to," she said, her voice firm despite the storm raging inside her. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd as Sophie walked toward the piano. Her steps were steady, but her heart raced, with every inch closer to the gleaming instrument. As she sat down on the piano bench, the weight of the room pressed on her like a tidal wave. Curious whispers buzzed faintly behind her. She could feel Adrian's piercing gaze, watching her every move, like a predator waiting for his prey to falter. Sophie let out a shaky breath, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the piano keys. Closing her eyes, she forced herself to block out the stares, the whispers, and the tension that filled the room. She needed to focus, to forget Adrian, Mallory's gaze, and the mockery behind this moment. She pressed the first key. The sound was soft but steady, a tentative note that seemed to call her back to a different time. The melody, hesitant at first, began to unfurl beneath her hands, each note resonating like a memory long buried. Her fingers, though stiff and unpracticed, found their way through the familiar rhythm. The hesitation faded as the music took hold, pulling her deeper into its embrace. It was Chopin, a piece Sophie had cherished as a child. The soft etching notes wrapped around her, filling the cavernous room with a fragile beauty that silenced the crowd moments ago. There had been murmurs, sneers, and indifference, but now there was nothing but the sound of the piano. The harsh stares and cold gazes began to blur, dissolving into the periphery. All that existed was the music, carrying her away from the present and into a world where she could breathe freely. With every passing moment, her hands moved with more confidence, more grace. The years of absence melted away, and she was not the tired, overworked, single mother anymore. She was the girl who had once sat at her family's aging piano, pouring her soul into every note. She could hear her mother's voice in her mind, clear and encouraging. Let the music take you where it wants to go, Sophie. Do not think about it, just feel it. And she did. She let the melody guide her, her hands flowing across the keys with a rhythm that felt like reconnecting with an old friend. The rustiness in her movements disappeared, replaced by fluid, almost effortless grace. She played with everything she had, her pain, her hope, and the dreams she had tucked away for so many years. The first piece came to an end. For a moment the room was suspended in silence. Sophie's heart raced as her fingers lingered on the keys. She opened her eyes, unsure of what she would see. Then came the applause. It started softly, hesitant, but quickly swelled into a thunderous ovation. Sophie barely registered it at first. She was still lost in the music, her mind swimming with emotion. The applause did not matter. What mattered was the overwhelming sensation surging through her, a feeling of wholeness she had not experienced in years. Without thinking, she began a second piece. This time it was Beethoven, bold, dramatic and filled with passion. The opening chords struck with confidence, her hands moving with a newfound strength that surprised even her. As the music swelled, filling every corner of the room, Sophie felt her pulse quicken. The melody rose and fell like a storm, powerful and haunting. She poured herself into the performance, giving everything she had. It was not just about playing the piano anymore. It was about reclaiming something she thought she had lost forever, a piece of herself. For too long Sophie had been weighed down by survival. She had lived for others, for Liam, for the endless grind of making ends meet. She had been overlooked, forgotten, reduced to nothing more than a shadow. But now, in this moment, she was more. She was radiant, undeniable, and alive. The final notes hung in the air, trembling before fading into silence. Sophie's chest heaved as she sat back, her fingers still resting on the keys. The echoes of the music lingered in the vast room. She turned her head slightly, her breath catching when her eyes found Liam. He was beaming, his face lit up with a grin so wide it made her heart ache. His little hands clapped wildly, and his eyes sparkled with pure admiration. In that instant, every fear and humiliation she had anticipated disappeared. Then, like a wave building momentum, the applause erupted again. It was not polite or obligatory. It was genuine, thunderous, and filled with awe. People stood clapping with smiles of disbelief, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Sophie blinked, dazed. She had braced herself for laughter, for scorn, for Adrian's satisfaction at her embarrassment. But there was none of that. The crowd was not mocking her. They were applauding her. She finally dared to look out into the sea of faces. People were nodding, smiling, whispering to one another in astonishment. A few reached for their handkerchiefs, clearly moved by the music she had played. Her heart pounded with disbelief and exhilaration. Then she saw Adrian. He stood near the back of the room, his expression unreadable. Gone was his usual smug confidence, replaced by something Sophie could not quite name. He was not clapping, nor was he smiling. If anything, he looked shaken, as though someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. His face was pale, his eyes wide, frozen in a stunned silence. He did not move, did not react. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She could not tell if it was shock, disbelief, or something deeper. that had unsettled him so completely. Without a word, Adrian turned abruptly and walked out of the room, his footsteps silent against the thick carpet. Sophie sat frozen, watching him disappear. The applause continued to thunder around her, but her focus remained on the door he had just walked through. She had no idea what had just happened, but she knew one thing: something had changed. Adrian Mallory's unreadable expression lingered in Sophie's mind long after he disappeared up the staircase without a word. He had not clapped, had not smiled. He had simply walked away, leaving a storm of questions in his wake. Before Sophie could fully process his reaction, the crowd surged toward her, a flurry of applause and admiration. "That was incredible," one guest exclaimed. "Where did you learn to play like that?" another asked, their tone dripping with awe. Sophie managed soft smiles and polite nods, her voice struggling to surface over the overwhelming wave of attention. For so long she had been invisible among these people, a shadow that moved through their world unnoticed. And now, in an instant, she was the center of their admiration, as if they were seeing her for the very first time. Her gaze darted through the room until she spotted Liam, who had moved closer to her, his small hand reaching up for hers. She took it, grounding herself in his steady, reassuring grip. No matter how surreal the moment felt, no matter how much praise was suddenly heaped on her, the only thing that truly mattered was the look in her son's eyes, bright, proud and filled with wonder. Around them, the party began to settle back into its rhythm. Conversations resumed, the hum of polite chatter filling the space once more, but the energy in the room had shifted. Sophie stood from the piano, feeling as though her world had tilted ever so slightly beneath her feet. "I think it is time we head home, sweetheart," she whispered to Liam. He nodded eagerly, the excitement of the evening beginning to fade into fatigue. Sophie gently guided him toward the exit, her steps careful and deliberate. She did not want to linger long enough for the magic of the moment to soar. As they reached the car and the doors closed behind them, Sophie allowed herself a moment to exhale. Yet even in her triumph there was a nagging unease. She could not shake the feeling that Adrian would not let this go. He was not the type to handle surprises gracefully, and she knew he did not like being blindsided. She stared out the window as the car pulled away, the mansion's glow fading into the distance. A strange mixture of pride and apprehension swirled inside her. She had poured everything into that performance, shown a piece of herself she had not revealed in years. But she could not stop, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Liam's soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, you are amazing," he said, his words filled with quiet awe. "I did not know you could do that." Sophie looked down at him, her heart swelling with love. She smiled, her voice just above a whisper. "I did not know I could either." They arrived home, the weight of the evening still heavy on Sophie's shoulders. She tucked Liam into bed, kissing his forehead as he drifted off to sleep, his little body curled up under his blanket. "Good night, my love," she murmured before retreating to the kitchen. Sophie sat at the edge of her bed later that night, her thoughts racing. The applause, the astonished faces, the way people had looked at her. It all felt like a dream. But it was not the applause that haunted her most. It was Adrian's face, pale and shaken, that lingered in her mind. He had been caught off guard, utterly unprepared for what he had seen. But what did it mean? What would he do next? Over the next few days, the weight of that question refused to leave her. Sophie tried to focus on her regular routine, pouring her energy into work and making life as normal as possible for Liam. But the memory of that night hovered over her, impossible to push aside. She was scrubbing dishes one evening when her phone buzzed on the counter. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she frowned at the unfamiliar number flashing across the screen. The message was short, but it sent a chill through her. "Sophie, this is Adrian Mallory. I would like to meet with you. Can we talk? Let me know when you are available." Her stomach clenched as her pulse quickened. The last thing she wanted was to be dragged back into Adrian's world. She had been bracing herself for some kind of fallout after the party, expecting a reprimand or worse. and now it seemed inevitable. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was he angry that she had stolen the spotlight? Was he planning to fire her from any future events? The questions tumbled through her mind in a chaotic swirl, none of them leading to anything good. Sophie took a deep breath and set the phone down, stepping to the window to stare out at the darkened street below for a moment. She considered ignoring the message altogether, but she knew that was not an option. Whatever Adrian Mallory wanted, she would have to face it. There was no other choice. With a deep breath she typed her reply. I am available tomorrow afternoon. Where would you like to meet? The response came almost immediately, a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Sophie frowned. It was not the sort of place she would ever associate with Adrian, far removed from the grandeur of his parties or the exclusivity of his favorite restaurants. The casual choice unsettled her. The next afternoon, Sophie arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early. Her nerves were in knots, her heart racing. She had chosen a simple outfit, something neat but unassuming. Walking into the cozy, intimate space, she felt out of place amidst the warm chatter and gentle hum of an espresso machine. Adrian was already there, sitting by a window, but he looked different. Gone was the sharp suit, the polished shoes, the air of effortless perfection. Instead, he wore a soft sweater and jeans. His hair, slightly tousled, gave him a disheveled, almost human appearance. For the first time, Sophie saw him without his usual armor. It caught her off guard. He stood as she approached, offering a faint, almost hesitant smile. Sophie, thank you for coming, she nodded, unsure of how to respond. The unease in her chest did not dissipate, but something in Adrian's demeanor, the quietness in his tone, made her pause. They sat across from each other, the silence between them stretching just long enough to be uncomfortable. Finally, Adrian cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the table. I have been thinking a lot about the other night, he began, his voice low, about what happened and about what I did. Sophie did not say anything. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She did not trust herself to speak yet. Adrian looked up, his expression unguarded. For the first time, it was not arrogance or indifference. It was vulnerability. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I was cruel to you and I knew it that night. I intended to humiliate you in front of everyone. Sophie's heart raced, anger flaring up as his words confirmed what she would long suspected. She bit her lip, forcing herself to stay composed as he continued. But you did something I did not expect, Adrian said, his voice softening. Your music. It reminded me of something I had not felt in years. It reminded me of my wife, of who I used to be when she was still alive. He glanced out the window, his eyes distant. Hannah used to play that piano every evening. It was her escape, her joy. I would sit and listen, and for a little while, everything felt right in the world. But after she died, I shut all of that away. I buried it along with the man I was. His voice grew quieter, almost breaking. When you played, it brought her back to me. Not just her memory, but the memory of who I was with her. And it hurt more than I expected. Sophie's breath caught. She had not anticipated this, the raw honesty, the guilt in his voice. For so long, she had seen Adrian as nothing more than a bitter, arrogant man, but sitting across from him now, she saw someone broken, someone drowning in grief and unsure how to surface. I am not proud of the man I have become, he admitted, meeting her eyes, and I realize now I have taken that out on everyone around me, especially you. The sincerity in his words left Sophie momentarily speechless. The anger she had carried for so long began to melt, replaced by a flicker of something else. Compassion. Maybe. I appreciate the apology, she said finally, her voice soft but steady. The world outside seemed to still, as though it too paused to absorb the weight of Adrian's words. Sophie sat across from Adrian Mallory, her thoughts spinning as she processed what she had just heard. She had not expected an apology, certainly not one so genuine. The man who had once taken pleasure in humiliating her now sat before her, stripped of his usual arrogance, humbled in a way that left her unsure how to respond. Adrian cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I have been thinking, he said carefully. his voice softer than she would ever heard it, "about what you did at the party, how you played, the way you brought the room to life. I have not seen anything like that in a long time, not since Hannah." Sophie's curiosity flickered at the mention of his late wife's name, but she stayed quiet, unsure of where this was going. "These parties used to mean something to me," Adrian admitted, running a hand through his hair. "They were not just about wealth or appearances, they were about bringing people together, sharing moments, but I lost that somewhere along the way. I have been hiding behind the champagne, the laughter, the extravagance. It is all felt empty." His gaze dropped to his hands, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if the weight of his confession was pressing down on him. "But that night," he continued, his voice steadying, "when you played, something shifted. I saw the way people responded to you, Sophie. They were not there for the party anymore. They were there for the music, for what you gave them." Sophie blinked, unsure of how to respond. She remembered the applause, the kind words from the guests, but she had not seen it the way Adrian had. Her focus had been on surviving the moment, on escaping without falling apart. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his tone more deliberate. "Now I want to bring back to my parties the real meaning behind them. I want to stop hiding behind all the glitz and start making these events meaningful again, and I think you can help me do that." Her heart skipped a beat. She tightened her grip on her coffee cup, her mind racing. "I do not understand," she said cautiously, wary of what he might ask. Adrian's gaze held hers steady and sincere. "I would like you to become the regular pianist at my events," he said. "No more serving drinks. No more blending into the background. I want you to be the highlight, the reason people come. I know it is a lot to ask. And after everything that happened, you have every reason to say no, but I think this could be something truly special." His words hung in the air between them, tempting and terrifying all at once. Sophie's chest tightened. Being a server at Adrian's parties was something she had grown used to. It was not glamorous, but it paid the bills, even if it chipped away at her dignity some nights. But this becoming the center of attention, stepping into the spotlight, it felt like too much. "I do not know," she said, her voice shaky. "I have not played in years, not professionally. What if I fail? What if people do not like it?" Adrian smiled gently, a kind of warmth in his expression she had not seen before. "You won't fail," he said. "You have already proven you can do this. And if it does not work out, you can always go back to serving. No harm done, but trust me, after the way people responded to you last time, they will love you." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. As his words sank in, she pictured Liam's face, the way he had looked at her that night, so proud and full of wonder. This could change everything for them. It could mean more security, more opportunities, maybe even a chance to dream again. But the fear of stepping into the unknown held her back. "What do you say?" Adrian asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. Sophie hesitated for a long moment, her thoughts swirling, but then something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the memory of the music flowing through her that night, or the way Liam had smiled up at her afterward. Maybe it was the thought of doing something she loved, again, of letting music be part of her life, in a way it had not been for years. Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay," she said. "I will do it. I will play." Adrian let out a breath, a look of relief washing over his face. "He won't regret it, I promise you that." The first party with Sophie as the featured pianist was a modest affair, at least by Adrian's usual standards. The crowd was smaller, the atmosphere more intimate. Sophie spent the entire day nervous, her stomach churning as she prepared. Her fingers, although still nimble, had not performed for an audience since that unforgettable night. But when the time came, she took her place at the piano, her hands poised above the keys, and then she let the music carry her away. To her surprise, the audience responded just as they had before. The applause was warm, genuine. Guests complimented her, their praise heartfelt. The tips she received far exceeded anything she had earned as a server. With each performance, Sophie's confidence grew. Party after party, She became an integral part of Adrian Mallory's events, a presence that guests began to expect. They requested specific pieces, ranging from classical masterpieces to modern melodies. Occasionally, someone would even jokingly ask her to play a pop song, curious to see if she could infuse it with the same grace she brought to everything else. She obliged, often surprising herself with how much she enjoyed it. As Sophie played, the tone of Adrian's events began to change. What had started as a tentative experiment quickly transformed into something far more meaningful. Her music was not just entertainment, it became the soul of the evening, waving a warmth into the gatherings that no one had anticipated. Guests were so moved by her performances that they began leaving generous tips or small notes of gratitude, tucked alongside crisp bills, a gesture that often brought tears to her eyes. The transformation of Adrian's parties did not happen overnight at first. It was subtle, fewer extravagant displays, quieter conversations, replacing the usual cacophony of status-driven chatter. Guests who had once come only to bask in luxury began noticing the shift, and to Sophie's surprise, they did not seem to mind. If anything, they were intrigued. Sophie's music became the centerpiece of the evenings. She was not just background ambience anymore. She set the tone, crafting an atmosphere of intimacy and authenticity that had been absent from Adrian's mansion for years. Gone were the ostentatious decorations and the endless flow of champagne meant solely to impress. In their place, Adrian created gatherings with a purpose. His mansion, once a shrine to wealth and status, was transformed into a space where people came together for something deeper. The parties became fundraisers for local charities, events to support community causes, and platforms to help those in need. While the guests still enjoyed themselves, the energy had shifted. There was a new depth to the evenings, a sense of shared humanity that had never existed before. Adrian threw himself into this new chapter with fervor. It was no longer about redemption for his past actions. It was about transformation, turning his resources into a force for good. The success of these parties was not measured by their extravagance, but by the amount of money raised for worthy causes. And the guests, once there to flaunt their connections, embraced this change wholeheartedly. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser for a local children's hospital, Adrian found Sophie still seated at the piano. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, her expression serene as the last note lingered in the air. Most of the guests had already left, but a few lingered to thank her for her beautiful performance. Adrian approached her with a glass of wine in hand, a rare gesture of camaraderie. He leaned casually against the piano, his tone light but sincere. "You are incredible, you know that." Sophie smiled, still warmed by the success of the evening. "Thank you. I am just happy to be part of something so meaningful." Adrian studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I have been thinking about something," he began, his voice dropping slightly. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had grown comfortable in her role, found a rhythm in playing at these events. She had not expected him to suggest anything beyond that. "You have been doing this for a while now," Adrian continued, "and it is obvious how much people love you. But I do not want this to just be a job for you, Sophie. I know how much music means to you." She met his gaze, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I see the passion you have for music," he said softly. "But I also know you did not get the chance to pursue it fully, not the way you should have. Life got in the way." Adrian paused, his expression resolute. "I have already spoken to a few people at the conservatory in town. They are willing to take you on. I would like to pay for your tuition so you can go back to school and study music properly the way you were meant to." For a moment Sophie was speechless. Her dreams of playing and studying music had been put on hold when Liam came into her life. She had never regretted it. Her son was her everything. But there had always been that quiet ache, the one she had pushed aside to focus on survival. "Adrian, her voice trailed off, the enormity of his offer washing over her. "That is too much. I could not accept that." You have brought life back into this house, into these events, Adrian said, his voice steady and heartfelt. You have helped me remember what it feels like to care about something. Again, I want you to have the chance to follow your dreams. Sophie, if this is how I can help, then please let me. Tears stung the corners of Sophie's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, unwilling to show how deeply his words affected her. I do not know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never thought going back to school. It was not even something I let myself hope for. Adrian smiled softly, a genuine expression that she had come to recognize as part of the man he was becoming. Say yes, he said simply. You have earned this. For a long moment, Sophie sat in silence, her heart torn between disbelief and gratitude. But as she looked at Adrian and saw the sincerity in his eyes, the way he had transformed from someone who had tried to belittle her into someone who wanted to lift her up, she knew her answer. She had spent too many years surviving, too many years putting her dreams on hold. Yes, she said softly, her voice steady, I will do it. The conservatory felt like stepping into a life Sophie had abandoned long ago, not by choice but by necessity. Walking through its grand doors for the first time, she was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions: excitement, fear, and above all, disbelief. She was really here. Adrian's generous offer had opened a door she thought would remain forever shut, but stepping through that door was not just about her, it was for Liam too. She wanted him to see that dreams did not die, they just sometimes waited for their moment. Her days quickly became a whirlwind of activity. Between Liam, her studies, and her ongoing performances at Adrian's, now charitable events, Sophie barely had time to catch her breath. But for the first time in years, her exhaustion was fulfilling. It came from doing something meaningful, something that filled her with purpose and joy. The conservatory was unlike anything Sophie had ever experienced. Most of her fellow students were young, fresh out of high school, with years of uninterrupted practice behind them. Many came from affluent families, their paths smooth and paved with opportunities Sophie had never known. At first the contrast stung. She felt the pang of self-doubt as she compared herself to these polished, confident students. A single mother in her 30s, who had taken a long and winding detour to arrive here. Sophie felt like an outsider, but as the weeks passed she found her footing. Her professors were encouraging, drawn to her raw talent and dedication. The years she had spent away from formal practice had not dulled her passion. Instead, her life experiences, the struggles, the resilience, the sacrifices, added depth to her music that few could replicate. Sophie brought something different to the conservatory, something that could not be learned through technique. Alone, balancing everything was a challenge. Liam went to school during the day, while Sophie attended classes and practiced relentlessly. Evenings were a blur of activity, picking Liam up from aftercare, rushing home to make dinner, and then diving into her homework once he was asleep. Some nights she sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling with exhaustion as they moved across the piano keys, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that she was building a better future for both of them. Liam, now 7, quickly became her biggest fan. He often sat beside her as she practiced at home, his bright eyes following her hands as they danced across the keys. Sometimes he hummed along to the melodies, his enthusiasm infectious. One evening, as Sophie played a soft, soothing piece, Liam reached out to touch the keys, mimicking her movements. Can you teach me, Mom? He asked, his small hands tapping the table in an imitation of her playing. Sophie looked at him, her heart swelling with love and pride. Of course, sweetheart, she said, smiling. We will start with something simple. You will be playing like me in no time. They began with the basics, scales and simple melodies. Liam took to it quickly, his excitement lighting up every lesson. Sophie found that teaching him reignited her own love for music in a way she had not expected. The piano became a shared bond between them, woven into the fabric of their daily routine. Every evening after dinner, Liam would sit beside her at the piano, his little fingers pressing the keys with concentration and determination. He had the same spark in his eyes that Sophie had once had as a child, the same awe at the magic of making music come alive. Watching him, Sophie could not help but wonder if this was the life they could have had all along, if circumstances had been different. But she did not dwell on what might have been. What mattered was that they were here now, creating a future filled with music, love and possibilities. Sophie's future was taking shape in ways she had never dared to imagine. Her performances at Adrian Mallory's events continued, but they began to carry an added layer of significance. Guests who had come to know her through Adrian's stories started seeking her out for their own occasions. She was invited to play at small, intimate weddings, elegant charity galas, and corporate events where music was not just a backdrop, but a centerpiece. These opportunities gave her a chance to earn additional income, something she had not anticipated but deeply appreciated. The connections she made through Adrian's guests soon turned into steady work, and before long, Sophie found herself performing outside his sphere. Entirely, her reputation began to grow, and with it, the realization that she was building something truly her own, no matter how full her schedule became. Sophie always made time for Liam. His love for the piano grew with each passing day. What had begun as simple lessons with his mother quickly blossomed into something deeper. One evening, Liam shyly asked if he could start taking formal lessons. Sophie could not have been prouder. The little boy who had once sat at her feet, wide-eyed as he watched her play, was now determined to follow in her footsteps. At one of Adrian's events, during a rare lull in the evening, he approached Sophie between sets. Handing her a glass of water, he offered her a grin. "I hear you are becoming quite the sought-after musician these days," he said. Sophie smiled back, a mix of gratitude and disbelief washing over her. "I never expected any of this. It is more than I ever thought possible." Adrian nodded thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping over the room where guests mingled, many of them having donated generously to the evening's cause. "You deserve it," he said, turning back to her. "And how's Liam doing with his lessons?" Her heart swelled at the mention of her son. "He is doing great, he loves it. I have signed him up for formal lessons now, and honestly, he is already better than I was at his age." Adrian chuckled softly, no surprise there. "He has got a great teacher." Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "I am just trying to keep up with him. He has got the same fire I had, maybe even more." There was a beat of comfortable silence between them, before Adrian's expression grew more serious. "You have worked so hard for all of this, Sophie," he said quietly. "You have built something incredible, not just for yourself but for Liam. I want you to know that I am proud of you." The words caught Sophie off guard. She had never imagined hearing such a sentiment from Adrian Mallory, the man who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a servant in his home. But now, standing here with so much behind them, and even more ahead, she realized how far they had both come. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I could not have done it without you." Adrian waved the sentiment away with a modest smile. "You could have, you would have. I just gave you a little nudge. The rest, that was all you." Sunlight poured through the large windows of the music studio, warming the polished floors and casting soft shadows across the room. The gentle hum of children's voices filled the air as Sophie sat at the piano, guiding a small group of students through their first steps in reading music. Their tiny fingers stumbled over the keys, but their wide, excited eyes filled Sophie with a sense of pride. This was her life now, a life she had once only dreamed of, now realized in the most unexpected way. After completing her studies at the conservatory, Sophie had been offered a teaching position. It was not just about performing anymore. It was about sharing her love of music with a new generation, about watching young faces light up as they discovered the magic within each note. Her students came from all walks of life. Some were the children of neighbors she had known for years, families who had never imagined they could afford piano lessons. Others came from wealthier backgrounds, drawn to her reputation after hearing her at Adrian's events. But when they sat at the piano, their backgrounds did not matter. They were all the same, wide-eyed, hopeful and eager to learn. Music, Sophie had come to realize, had a way of breaking down barriers like nothing else. The years of struggle and sacrifice had given Sophie more than strength. They had given her a depth of understanding that made her an extraordinary teacher. She knew what it felt like to dream, and then be forced to set those dreams aside. She understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. Now she was determined to help these children hold on to their dreams, to show them that anything was possible, with passion and perseverance. Each time a student mastered a new piece, or played their first melody with confidence, Sophie felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was not just a job, it was a calling, a way to give back, to inspire, and to ensure that the power of music continued to thrive in the hearts of a new generation. Sophie's son Lime was growing into a fine young musician. Now 10 years old, he had developed his own deep love for the piano. Under Sophie's careful guidance, his talent had blossomed into something extraordinary. While he still practiced with her, his lessons had become more advanced, and he was beginning to develop his own style, his own musical voice. Sophie watched him with immense pride, knowing that her journey had inspired him to carve out a path of his own. At home, their modest apartment was still simple, but it was filled with music and laughter. The struggles of their past remained part of their story, yet they no longer defined Sophie's life. She had learned to move forward, to let her successes and moments of joy fill the spaces where hardship had once loomed so heavily. Adrian Mallory had undergone a transformation of his own. His grand estate, once a cold fortress of wealth and isolation, had become a hub of warmth and purpose. The parties he hosted were no longer about flaunting wealth or status, but were dedicated to charity work, fostering community and making a tangible difference. Each event had a purpose, raising funds for causes close to Adrian's heart. He poured his resources into supporting organizations that helped underprivileged children, funded music programs in schools, and provided scholarships to young artists. The man who once lived behind an emotional wall had become a beacon of generosity. One evening, Adrian hosted a particularly meaningful event, a benefit concert to raise money for a new music school for underprivileged children. It was a project that both Sophie and Adrian had worked on tirelessly, their shared passion for music driving them to make it a reality. Sophie took her place at the grand piano, the very instrument she had once admired from afar, but now commanded with grace and confidence. The room buzzed with excitement as the guests settled into their seats, the hum of anticipation filling the air. But tonight Sophie was not playing alone. Standing beside her was Liam, his small hands hovering over the keys, his face a mixture of focus and pride. This was not just her moment, it was theirs. The little boy who had once watched her from the shadows, who had witnessed her rise from a life of quiet struggle, was now ready to step into the light alongside her. His talent was a reflection of the love and dedication Sophie had poured into him, and tonight they would share the stage as equals. As their music filled the room, weaving a tapestry of emotion and melody, Sophie and Liam became one with the piano. The notes soared, each one carrying the weight of their shared journey. It was a moment neither of them would ever forget, a mother and son united by a passion that had brought them through their darkest days. When the final note faded into the air, the room erupted in thunderous applause. It was louder and more heartfelt than anything Sophie had ever experienced. She stood from the piano, her heart racing, and took Liam's hand together. They bowed as the applause surged around them, a wave of appreciation and admiration that seemed endless. Mother and son, partners in a life that had come full circle, stood side by side basking in a moment they had both worked so hard to achieve. As the applause echoed through the hall, Sophie felt her heart swell with gratitude. In that moment, the struggles, the sacrifices, and the uncertainties of the past all felt worth it. They had made it for the first time in her life. Sophie felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, both for herself and for her son. Music had brought them here, and it would continue to guide them forward, one note at a time,